Hi, welcome to the Small Festival Book Club, and we've been discussing Against the Grain by J.C Scott, and as part of that I set out one of two videos which sought to explain his ideas and basically arguing that what he's trying to do is change the way we understand three different things that I called history, the outcasts of history and the state. So today in this second video I'm going to move to critique and ask how well he does this, setting out the book's potential strengths and weaknesses and asking if he succeeded in what he set out to do. And I'm going to argue that there are really important weaknesses in Scott's argument, but for those who are receptive to his approach, and I'll say what I mean by that later, this is a very impressive, highly stimulating and really a perspective altering book. And I'm going to talk about these limits on one hand and the achievements on the other in what the football speak would call a game of two halves, weaknesses versus strengths, with each half being made up of three parts. So in the first half, the weaknesses will be discussed under the following heading, and I think they're straightforward. The first, babies and bathwater; the second, limits and applicability; and the third, anarchist overreach. And likewise, the second half strengths, I'm going to discuss those under three headings. The first one's a long one: focused, fresh, credible and clear. That's one heading. The next one, perspective altering, and finally the third, anarchist classic. So beginning with the weaknesses then, and beginning with the weaknesses is probably a good intention of where I aim to go with this, but I do think it's fair to argue that the book has some important weaknesses, and one is the way in which the politics underneath the book at times, and I don't think by any means this is all the time, but at times pushes towards a more kind of essentialist, good-bad presentation of categories, big categories like barbarians or the state or civilization. And I think because of this, it can be argued that, various babies get thrown out of the water. So for me, he does a brilliant job of depicting the early state as an instrument of slavery and oppression. But the critique is so good that it sort of discards the possibility that there could ever be a kind of purposeful state as an instrument for good. And I suppose, this is natural, of course, because Scott's an anarchist. But for those like myself, and there might not be that many of them, who experienced the post-Second World War reforming social democratic state, which for all its contradictions and all its compromises humanised capitalism and created the NHS and made it possible for working class people to improve their lives. So for people who experienced that kind of state, I suppose in that kind of way, it suggests that a different kind of state is possible to the one that's being described by Scott. And surely, I think the same complexity of character and content is even more applicable to the idea of civilization. When Gandhi was asked what he thought of Western civilization, he said it would be a good idea, which is, of course, a very witty response. But isn't this also civilization critiquing itself? Just as Scott's university-generated and technologically replicated book is civilization critiquing itself. And it seems to me that in that alone there is value in our civilization. But even beyond this, whilst the embodiment of the hunter-gatherers, which Scott really shows very, very well, and whilst this embodiment is a wonderful thing, there is still arguably also great richness in our civilization and in the pleasures of the mind. So what might be argued for here is maybe for greater perspective or balance. Some, for instance, might see the overbearing state not as the inventor of oppression, but more an upscaling of already present human characteristics. And perhaps there is something seductive in Scott's account, tempting us to replace what amounts to an essentialist story called The Ascent of Man with its mirror opposite, now renamed The Descent of Man. So there are clear limits here, and these point to a second set of arguments about the limits and the applicability of the book. Because there are also problems with exactly how much Scott can claim to have shown in this book. And I think a big part of what he wants to make claims about is the state. But by restricting his analysis to the early agricultural state and by refusing to engage with modern society, this limits what he can convincingly say about the state or the contemporary state. And some also feel that he doesn't really properly define the state or how it might differ from other forms of social organisation. He talks about certain places having polities, but what's the difference between a state and a polity? And for those who really want to get detailed in their criticisms, they might point out that just as he works with a global but not necessarily closely defined idea of the state, his lumping together of all non-state people into the global category of hunter-gatherers ignores horticulturalists and pastoralists and perhaps many other types of people and the myriad ways in which they might have organised themselves in pre-agricultural time. So what looks like sweeping theory to some, on closer inspection, can seem much more limited to others. Yes, he convincingly claims at some point in time change happened and it was bad for people, but beyond this, perhaps it's not that clear what else he can claim. And this refusal to move his thesis into the modern space also leaves him potentially unable to speak to the plight that we face today, unable to give us insights from an earlier experience to help us in the here and now. So that, as credible and well argued as the book is, there is for some a sense of the so what about the book. What is its prescription and what does it say to us and the predicament that we face? And I think for readers who feel this way, these limits are very much apparent in what seems to them a very sudden and problematic ending, which really seems much more like a stop than a finish, and whose tone and conclusion is much more equivocal, much less strident, much less clear, and in many ways much more out of step with the energy and the force of all the preceding argument. And for some, this equivocation also suggests that the anarchist politics that emanate from the book in some senses overreaches itself, which leads to my final potential weakness, which I've called anarchist overreach. And I guess this is perhaps much more an argument more directed to the possibilities of anarchism generally. And my sense is that Scott is a very distinguished anarchist scholar whose work has been very influential. For instance, his book, The Weapons of the Weak, was an important reference during the Arab Spring. But for critics of anarchism, the Arab Spring, and in particular the experience of Egypt, is really a classic counter-argument to the anarchist case. So the Arab Spring begins as a kind of, a great spontaneous surge of shared human energy and creative power in a protest movement that manages to topple its dictator Hosni Mubarak, and I think is rightly seen as an achievement of a certain kind of anarchist politics. But for the critics, the downside is that fairly soon the kind of anti-organisational, anti-politics politics of the protesters in some way gives way to the very supreme organisation of firstly the Muslim Brotherhood and secondly and much more definitively the army. leaving some to conclude if you don't engage with the forms of power in society, you leave its massive resources to those who seek more power and more control. So these are the criticisms of the book, and to me they seem like really, substantial and significant criticisms. But for all of this, for those receptive to the book, and here, with the usual caveats about, yes, you can't simplify and generalise, put on the table, those who are receptive to the book are broadly those of the left, liberal, intellectual disposition. And for those people, it remains a deeply impressive, highly stimulating and perspective-altering book. And of course, that brings us to part 2, to look at the strengths and achievements. And the first of 3 different headings under the self-explanatory, if very long heading, focused, fresh, credible and clear. And beginning with focus, it can be argued that neither Scott's academic skill or the value of the book depends on some of those criticisms that I was talking about before, on the definition of the state, or extending the argument beyond the agricultural state. Because for them, what he's chosen to focus on is something incredibly profound. So our move into agriculture and into the state is an incredible moment of transformation with profound consequences, many of which speak directly to what might be argued is a kind of crisis or a deep malaise in our own contemporary civilization, a civilization premised to a large degree on the drive for control over nature and over people. And I think it's fresh also because, ironically, like the early Enlightenment thinkers, he does so much to critique. Scott clears away a lot of old intellectual rubbish, clearing the ground of unexamined and unsustainable assumptions. And in doing so, he kind of makes much more space for new thinking, and the kind of new thinking that he presents, for me, is a bold, imaginative, and in many ways startling argument, dismantling the narrative of progress and presenting the early state as a kind of violent parasite, which it stayed like for most of its life. And he does all of this against the prevailing orthodoxy and with a certain amount of academic and political ambition. And I think it's credible because, in his own terms, which I admit are both highly focused as well as very broad and sweeping, I do think Scott brings a great deal of intellectual skill and rigour to his project. It's incredibly clear, his argument, and incredibly well expressed. And he gives arguments once much more associated with a kind of New Age feeble-mindedness, much greater authority and persuasion, allowing his insights to really land and be taken seriously. And all of this is expressed in crystal clear argument and language in a very powerful and convincingly argued book. So that might seem like there's all the strengths, but to continue, it's with this constellation of strengths that Scott embarks on a kind of journey of what I'd call intellectual shape-shifting, which brings us to the second and the book's standout area of strength, which is his capacity to alter perspective. And he reframes a whole host of concepts and arguments over the nature of history and civilization and the state and slavery and disease and complexity and collapse. And all of these are re-evaluated against a kind of pre-agricultural, pre-civilized, pre-stated existence. And in many ways, it's a kind of existential inquiry into the conditions of human life, which I found provoking and convincing and stimulating, and whose arguments I felt powerfully illuminated our own condition at a time when arguably we're facing our own moment of human transformation. And the double meaning of the word state, both as a machine of power and a human state of being, I think speaks in the book to a different kind of relationship with nature at a moment when our own natural world and arguably our modern control-obsessed civilization is in crisis. And far, I think, from ignoring the modern state, his supporters might claim that he's found its historic DNA, which, despite age upon age of change, continues to be passed on and runs through the multiple generations of state forms. And today you might see it in what some people might call a warfare state, or a pandemic state, or even a prison labour slavery state, manifestations of which I think are observable across the world, not least in the great power states of China and America, where the Uyghurs in Chinese camps and the overwhelmingly black prison population in America are, new forms of unfree labour, or maybe the same forms of unfree labour. And equally, Scott's attention to the pathology of the early state, as a kind of scaled up petri dish of disease, I think also works to echo and highlight our own pathologies of modernity, something which I think has been much explored by many disciplines, and is perhaps best expressed in Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. But all of these kinds of works and arguments all sort of argue that in different ways power, control or repression negates human flourishing and works instead to radically simplify, de-skill, diminish and deform human experience. And this is why I think Scott's template for the lived existence of people coming into agriculture and into the state acts as both as a kind of mirror for our existing society, but also a kind of metaphor of what our future might be. And again, I've got to say, this is for people receptive to Scott's thinking. But for those kinds of people, what's mirrored is our own ecologies of control and institutionalised mechanisms of power, like prison systems and the industries of profit and control which are interwoven with them. And of course, all of this is pure anarchism. This is the premise of anarchism. And more negatively, it's also been the fear behind many a doom-laden prediction of our totalitarian future, which of course we've heard before. You might say in 1984 to be exact, which of course is the title of Orwell's great classic of how state control destroys, for want of a better word, the human soul. And in this regard, I think Scott makes Orwell's classic seem more real and closer to home, which is to say that Scott's doom-laden trajectory of human diminishment seems more real and closer to home. And it's also in line, I think, with a good deal of really interesting and innovative thinking about our future. And here I'm thinking of two other paradigm-shifting authors whose work I think complements each other as well as complements that of Scott. That is to say, Ian McGilchrist and his book The Master and His Emissary, and Noah Harari and his book Homo Deus. And both these authors set out a trajectory for humanity and for our future which looks an awful lot like the story told by Scott. Take, for example, this small part of Harari's conclusion to Homo Deus, which I think really comes across as a super upgraded Scott for the postmodern computer age. And this is what Harari says in that conclusion. In the early 21st century, the train of progress is again pulling out of the station, and this will probably be the last train ever to leave the station, called Homo sapiens. Those who miss this train will never get a second chance. In order to get a seat, you need to understand the powers of biotechnology and computer algorithms. The main products of the 21st century will be bodies, brains and minds, and the gap between those who know how to engineer bodies and brains and those who do not will be far bigger than the gap between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. In the 21st century, those who ride the train of progress will acquire divine abilities of creation and destruction. All those left behind will face extinction. So this is all very powerful stuff, and I don't think it's meant to be taken literally. But I do think here there is a really powerful kind of insight which is common to all three writers, that is to say McGilchrist, Harari and Scott. And reading Scott, striking in its own right, also illustrates and works to amplify these other two great thinkers in a way that makes Scott's book a kind of, for me, a template for thinking about our future. And this is why, although I'm not an anarchist, my feeling is that this is a really good book. This is an anarchist classic, both compelling and, for me, paradigm shifting. Such that I found, his account of the early state as a machine for power and domination, absolutely. His account of agriculture as the inventor of work, as an endless, unfree drudgery, absolutely. And giving an account of the scale in diminishment in our skill and sensibility that went with all of this, absolutely. So I find it completely convincing. And so to conclude, this small book is not perfect, but I found it deeply satisfying, and for me very much good enough to challenge my thinking. And this is not to say that it has completely and fundamentally changed all of my beliefs and understandings, but it has made me think much more carefully about them. And so, as a non-anarchist, I salute this fine piece of anarchist literature.